Hello, everyone. Glad so many of you could make it today. I'm going to do a formal introduction in just a moment because we're recording this, both video back there, say wave to the camera, hello, and we're also recording the audio for possible broadcast on Minnesota Public Radio. So I'll do a formal introduction, but I wanted to do an informal one and just say thank you for all of you showing up, and big welcome to Chris Farrell for coming out today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
I've got about 25 minutes maybe or so of stuff that I thought we could talk about.
Sure.
And then we've got a microphone over there by the bar for questions. The bar isn't open, you probably noticed. But we've got the microphone over there. I'll open it up, and I'd like to hear questions that you have for Chris and about what we've been talking about. So,
and just one thing, just so you know, if you're asking a question over there, I may not look at you in order to stay on the mic. So it's not that I'm ignoring you or I'm trying to be rude or, God, it's that this is what Sarah Meyer, who's the producer, is going to want. So just so you know.
She's trained us well.
Yes.
She's trained us well. All right, here we go. Welcome to our conversation with Chris Farrell on Purpose and a Paycheck, Finding Meaning, Money, and Happiness in the Second Half of Life. Today's session here at College of St. Benedict and St. John's University is part of our celebration of Money Smart Week. Money Smart Week began as a coordinated effort of the Money Smart Advisory Council, a group of 40 Chicago area organizations working together to promote personal financial literacy. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago convened the council's first meeting in July 2001, and the first Money Smart Week was held in 2002. It's now gone nationwide and has been held this week in April ever since. The focus is on discussions and presentations by community groups, financial institutions, government agencies, educational organizations like ours, financial experts, all of which are designed to help consumers learn better to manage their personal finances. We are especially happy to have Chris Farrell visit us for Money Smart Week. Chris is Senior Economics Contributor at Marketplace, American Public Media's group of nationally syndicated business and economic programs. He is economics commentator for Minnesota Public Radio and host of its series Conversations on the Creative Economy. Chris is a columnist for PBS Next Avenue and the Star Tribune, and he's written for Bloomberg Business Week, the New York Times, Kiplinger's, and other publications. Chris's most recent books focus on the intersection between earning a living and finding meaning in life. So let me go back a little bit. In The New Frugality, which is a book from 10 years ago, Chris anticipated what I'm calling our Marie Kondo moment and asked us to think about what is it that gives us joy and contentment in our financial lives rather than simply accumulating more and more stuff. Then in his next book, Unretirement, he traced the development of an important new phenomenon. More and more Americans continuing to work past the age of 65, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And now in his new book, Purpose and a Paycheck, Chris weaves together these two strands to tell a story of how changing work patterns and consumption habits are going to affect our economy and our society more generally. Finally, on top of all of this, I'm happy to call Chris a friend. So Chris, welcome to the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you. And I always like, meeting in a pub.
I know, it's the place where we can actually have a conversation, and we have a whole bunch of people here to join us. We'll take some questions from the audience in a little while, but first I want to keep you to myself. So, first of all, the title of your new book is Purpose and a Paycheck, and if you think about it, that's a lot to cover in one book. So, before we get into any details or anything like that, is there like one or two points that if they could only sit with us for a couple of minutes here, that you would want a listener to remember about your book?
Two things. When I travel around and I talk to people and I talk about working longer, working well into the traditional retirement years, there's always this question, well, do they need to work or do they want to work? And for a majority of people, it's both. They need a paycheck. makes a big difference for retirement security, financial security in the elder years. So that paycheck is incredibly important. But at the same time, they want to do something that they feel good about, that makes a difference, that leaves a legacy. So as you see, I have white hair. So I've reached the age where one of the really exciting things is a lot of young college graduates will call me and say, can I have an informational interview? And they know what a job is, but what is this thing called a career? And there are these wonderful discussions about they want to be financially independent, they want to make a living, but at the same time, they want to do something that they feel proud about, that is doing good. And I applaud that. I think that's incredibly important. When I have conversations with someone who's 60-something, it's the exact same conversation. I need to make some money, I need to have an income, but I want to do something that I feel proud about, that has purpose, that has meaning. And the only difference between the two generations is that if you're a young college graduate, time is infinity. If you're in your 60s, you're a little aware that it's shorter.
Well, so that gets right to one of my next things I wanted to ask, which is one of the first things you mentioned in the book is the myth of creative decline. Could you explain what that is? And especially, so I'm 58. I'm starting to see that horizon myself a little bit. And, you know, I don't think of myself as declining. So what is this myth?
So there's this, one of the dire dirges in our economy is the demographics of aging. So as you know, Louis, we're going to have just too many dependent elderly supported by too few young people. And so the underlying creativity, the innovation, the dynamism of this economy is going to erode with that scenario. Part of that scenario assumes that creativity declines with age. That at some point, you're not that creative, you're not that innovative, you don't have that intellectual or emotional drive. And the thing is, if you think about it for even 1 minute, it's fundamentally wrong. So back in 2005, February, I went to the Museum of Modern Art, and it was an exhibit of Henri Matisse, and it was his cutouts. And so you probably all, maybe you had them on your dorm room wall at some point in college, but it's those magnificent cutouts, the Blue Nude series, the swimming pool, and most art scholars consider it the height of his creativity. Well, he did the cutouts from a wheelchair and a bed from the ages of 74 to 84. He died at age 84. And then you think about Laura Ingalls Wilder. When we were, our family, we lived in Germany for a couple of years in the early 1960s, and my sister and I would share those books, and we loved them. And she had written a book that was essentially a memoir about growing up on the prairie. It got rejected by every publisher, so she turned it into a fictional series, and it was published when she was 65 years old. And she wrote it between the ages of 60 and 65. And you look at the recent Academy Awards, and what you saw is there were a lot of people who were being celebrated, and they're in their 60s and they're in their 70s, Spike Lee, Glenn Close, and they weren't being celebrated for what they had done in their 20s and 30s. They were being celebrated for what they had just done, and they're still continuing to create. And then you look at the skilled trades, and over time you realize people become more and more skilled, and you look at the profession. So anyway, as you look throughout our society, what you find out is so much of creativity is building on experience. And there's this expression, connect the dots, and you can call that wisdom, but that's also another way of describing creativity. You draw on these shards of knowledge, these shards of experience, and you create something new. And so if you're creative in your 20s, you're going to be creative in your 60s. If you're creative in your 30s, you're going to be creative in your 70s.
So you called it the myth of creative decline. Where did this myth start? Because I see exactly what you're talking about, especially working in an academic setting. This continues on throughout your career. You don't just publish a bunch of stuff in your 30s and then hang it up, but yet it really has grabbed hold all over our society that, well, you've hit your peak and now you're going to go down. Where does that come from, do you think?
And gracefully move away,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Just sort of,
make room for the next group.
So I think it really does come out of, or at least part of it, does come out of the shift in our economy toward mass production. So when you look at the mass production economy and as it emerged, particularly the automobile industry would be the classic example, there was this belief that because the assembly line had to move so fast, and you're moved by the clock, the standardization, the measurement of productivity, that by the time you were 40, 45, you were pretty much done for, and they wanted young people in the assembly line. And I think that, to a large extent, accounts for a lot of it. So there's a sense that when you're young, you can run fast. When you're young, you can work the 24/7. When you're young, you can do this. And so we ended up saying, well, by the time you get to we change, it's no longer your 40s, but
right.
As you get to your late 50s, it's time to think about making your exit. And people will say to you, when are you going to retire? As if, and I opened the book with this wonderful passage from Kenneth Galbraith. And he wrote it when he was 90 years old. And he called it the affliction of the still syndrome. And it's afflicted by the young and near retirees. And so people will come up to him and they'll say, you're still exercising. You're still drinking. His favorite was, you're still writing. And then it was, you're still alive. I didn't realize this. Now, he wrote this essay in his 90s, and he lived another 7 years, and he continued to write. And so I just think it's something that we have sort of built into our society. It's an expectation. And to a certain extent, in the workplace, as you get older, as you near those traditional retirement years, are you being given the opportunity to exercise your creativity? Are you being given the opportunity to be innovative? Are you being given that opportunity to connect the dots?
So that brings us to another theme that I think runs throughout your book, which is the role of entrepreneurship. And I've got a couple things I want to ask you about that, but first of all, how would you define what an entrepreneur or carrying out entrepreneurship is? Because I couldn't find that anywhere. It was I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No.
I saw it in there, I think.
So I have a very broad definition of entrepreneurship. And I think one of the problems of our discussion about entrepreneurship is the sort of dominance of the Silicon Valley model of what an entrepreneur is. So an entrepreneur is typically a young person willing to work 24/7, trying to create this bizarre term called a unicorn, trying to create a unicorn. And to me, if you're an independent contractor and you're self-employed and you have a little business, you're an entrepreneur. You got a 1099. Mm-hmm. You have to figure out your taxes. What the entrepreneur does is solve a problem and gets paid to solve a problem. And so I think entrepreneurship at all ages and of all kinds should be celebrated because it's not that easy, but it is engaging, and that is where often purpose and a paycheck do come together because most of the time people don't become entrepreneurs in something that they don't like. They'll build on their skills, they'll build on their knowledge, and they know how to solve a problem. So entrepreneurship to me is a very broad category of engagement, some of which creates incredible wealth.
I like that word engagement because I saw 3 points that I wanted to dig in with you about. So first of all is, as you just said, one of your points is entrepreneurship is not just for the young. It's for everybody.
It's for everybody. So in recent years, a quarter of all new businesses have been formed by the 55 to 64-year-old age group. And that's up from about 15% back in 1997. And a lot of these businesses are relatively small, but if you think about it, it makes sense because you have experience. You have knowledge, you know how to solve a problem. And so a lot of businesses are set up. You might have been pushed out through a layoff. You might have decided, I'm tired of being told to work 40 hours, to work 50 hours for 40 hours pay. And I have this idea, it's been nagging me, it's in the back of my mind. And it turns out that significant majority of people, it's actually the opportunity. But there is a significant minority that are pushed into it. But you're going to solve a problem. Mm-hmm. And it's also incredibly creative.
And that actually is the next thing I wanted to get at, which is it's not just about getting rich. Like we usually think of entrepreneurs, you mentioned the unicorns. I'm going to create this new app, and then I'm going to get an initial public offering. Now I'm going to be a billionaire. Yay.
Yay.
It's like, no, that's not what when I read the stories in your book, for example, I don't see that as what's motivating these people. It's a byproduct, but it's not a motivation.
It's not a motivation. And even for the people there's a group of people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, they're serial entrepreneurs. And what they do is create new businesses. And even for them, the money is a validation of what they're doing, but what they really like doing is coming up with an idea, pulling together a team, going out there, convincing some people to give them some money, and then build a new enterprise, and then move on to the next one. But for a lot of people, and the entrepreneurship is a big surprise for me. 15 years ago, I would not have written about entrepreneurship the way that I did, because my sense was, don't touch that 401k. Don't touch that retirement savings plan. To start a business, what, are you crazy? Now, you still don't touch that 401k or that retirement savings to start a business, but most of the businesses are being formed less than $5,000 and actually less than $1,000. The office is a home,
Really?
or a low-cost co-sharing workspace. You have computers, you do your accounting online, you do your taxes online, and now the business is going to take more money, reinvest it into it, but to start a business, to test it out, drawing on your connections and your human capital, your knowledge and your skill. Most of these businesses aren't starting out with a lot of capital. The capital is, in a sense, I'm not sure this is the right term, it's like a sunk cost.
Right.
You own your home, so you turn part of your home into an office, but you already own that home. Now, if you were being really technical, you could assign a cost to that.
Right. If we're economists, there's an opportunity cost to that, right? My students would recognize this phrase. But when I was reading this part of your book, that was the part where I was starting to get cynical. It's like, well, how do you get the money to do this, And so, in a sense, it's taking what you got and using it in a different way.
That's right. And then the ones who are typically trying to build a bigger enterprise, a more durable enterprise, then you use other people's money. But they also are very skilled at using other people's money, and there's nothing wrong with that. They're investors and they take the risk, or they're bankers and they take the risk. But there is this expression that the economy has evolved where it's less physical and it's more intangible. And I think this reflects that. To illustrate it, there's a wonderful passage in Keith Richards' book, Life. And he talks about how expensive it was to get half an hour of recording studio time in London in the 1960s. And it was literally that you walked in and you had half an hour. And it was incredibly expensive. And now he says you can have a much better studio for $5,000 or less in your garage. And so the economy has become, and I think technology is really helping a lot of this entrepreneurship and this innovation. But whenever you're thinking about it, it's really what you're working off of is less financial capital and more your human capital. It's who you know, your knowledge, and how to solve a problem. And you figured out, I can sell you my services because I can solve a problem, and it's going to make it easier on you.
The economist Diane Coyle from Great Britain, she calls this the weightless world.
Right.
And I had never thought about this, that another way of putting what you're saying, I think, is the weightless world especially benefits people who are looking for a purpose and a paycheck at the
It
same
really
time.
does. And the other thing that has happened is an ecosystem has arisen in so many places around entrepreneurship, accelerators, incubators, co-sharing workspaces. And it's not just that these are places where you can go and do your work, but it's also you can get advice, you can get mentorship. And now when you look at the ads or the discussions, it's always someone with these incredible ads running through the mountains of Colorado and, it's got a hoodie and they're in the Boundary Waters. But if you actually walk into most of them, it's actually multi-generational and it's a mix of people. And I think that the ecosystem needs to be much more encouraging for people in the second half of life to come in. and say, this is welcome because this is what's good for the community. Think about what entrepreneurship, the way I'm describing it, does for the community. You're continuing to pay taxes. You're continuing to solve problems. You're living in the community so you care about what happens. And so you're deeply involved. And you are not this image of the dependent person. You are engaged, you're functioning, and you're creative.
That actually is something I wanted to get at, which is the functioning creative, and not just caring about money carries over into the idea that entrepreneurship isn't just about the profit sector, but it's also for the nonprofit sector, for the things that, in a sense, we take for granted are going to get done.
Yes. And so one of the really exciting good things that's happening in our economy is the rise of social entrepreneurship. So, there's all different variations of what you can do and how you can organize. It can be a nonprofit organization. It can be what's called a B Corp, so that you can take certain kinds of outside money, but to limit your profit. But there's this motivation to create an organization that's going to solve a problem. And it's this entrepreneurial mindset that's being adopted. And there is something that does go on later in life where when you're thinking about purpose and a paycheck, there is a lure toward social entrepreneurship. There is a lure toward the nonprofit organization. There is a lure toward getting involved in an organization with a mission that you really believe in. And that notion of making a difference does become more important. And so social entrepreneurship and regular entrepreneurship, to me, they largely feed off of each other. They're largely the same entity. One has more of a nonprofit focus. One may have more of a for-profit focus. But when you talk to the people who are doing it, it's all about purpose and staying in business.
Right. Staying engaged.
You need cash flow.
So just a pause here. A number of people have come in as we're talking. We're talking about Chris Farrell's new book, Purpose and a Paycheck. Copies of the book are available for those who are actually here in the Brother Willie's Pub. We're also going to take some questions from the audience in a few minutes. So if you've got questions, think about them, formulate them. The microphone is over there by the bar, so we'll get to you shortly. You just brought up something that is very interesting to me, which is this starts to connect with thinking about your whole life, not just in the second half, but over the course of your whole life. That, here at a college, students are thinking about their first job.
Right.
Or what I'm going to do in the first 5 or 10 years of my life. But what you've described is something that someone in their 20s ought to be thinking about now, both in terms of what they want to do, but also their personal finances. So could you speak a little bit about that?
So I'm really glad you raised that because there has been this image of what life is, and particularly for the boomer generation. It was just a very powerful image, which is you go to school, you work really hard, and then you retire, which means you say goodbye to your colleagues for the rest of your life and you embrace leisure. And what is that? But what is that? Those silos are breaking down. And part of it is because a young college graduate from St. John's or St. Ben's, what does it mean to have a 60-year career? Even a 70-year career, knocking on wood in terms of health. And so yes, you've had this education that gets you launched. But the demographics of aging means that our educational institutions, our higher educational institutions, are going to need to adjust to this older workforce that wants to come back to school, needs some additional education, but it's not to take the econ history course that they wish they had had time to take, but they didn't take.
They should have taken.
And they should have taken. And they come back and you give a week-long course or whatever. But they want to come back and they want to take that econ history course because they're curious and they're interested. But they also want to pick up some skills and some additional knowledge, a certificate that they can then take to another employer. And I think it's incredibly liberating for young people because what it means is, when my soon-to-be 27-year-old, my youngest, is 50 years old, he's going to have a very different vision of what the rest of life means than I do right now. Right now, we're going through a period of experimentation, phased retirement, part-time work, flexible work, gig economy work, starting your own business, self-employment. There's all these experimentations that are going on. But I think over the next 20 years, 20, 30 years, we're going to have a lot of changes in institutions like higher education that are going to adjust and are going to support a career that has a lot more transitions. And if that's the case, then that actually does change the way you think about managing your money.
So I'm going to connect this with entrepreneurship and then come back to managing your money. So, for example, one of the phenomena that I keep seeing is more and more colleges are partnering to build what they sometimes call villages for 55 plus near a college campus so that the people who live there can take classes, go to art events, do all that kind of stuff. What I hear you saying is that you could actually tap into that, for example, and have a co-working space on campus.
You should.
Or that they should be participating in an entrepreneurship center or something like that. That we should not think about it as just them tapping into the college, but the college tapping into those people.
The knowledge and the expertise. And then if there's an idea that they like, perhaps a little financing.
That sounds exciting to me, especially, again, since I'm 58, thinking about those things. So the personal finance part, I'm glad you brought up the 401k thing, because when I think about how people plan over the course of their life, they think about, all right, I need to have enough over the course of what economists call my life cycle, so that when I hit this target date, I can then live off that. So does the scenario you're describing change that way of thinking about your personal finances and what we call retirement saving?
I think it does, because if you think about the whole discussion about retirement savings, personal finance over the past 3 decades, the 401k era, has been dominated by this notion of saving for one big transition, a big transition. So you're going from the work world to the non-work world. You're going from work to leisure. And so therefore, it's all about how much are you saving in your 401k and where are you putting your assets? And there's always been that question, what is my number? Have I saved enough that I can live off the rest of my life off my accumulated savings?
And will I run out? I mean, that's one that people are talking about a lot now is, I might run out.
Exactly. And there's this growing notion that you can't have a 40-year career and live for 30 years off your accumulated savings for most people. So I think we should actually change the discussion to thinking about saving for transitions. And there are a lot of transitions in your life. You may get married, you may have children, you change jobs, you want to go back to school to pick up some additional education. And by the way, these things aren't all being crowded around in your 20s, but this may be happening in your 40s, in your 50s. And so think about savings actually becomes even more important than you would think in the personal finance literature, because what it really is, you want to save to fund transitions. And it's less important how much you have in stocks and how much you have in bonds. What is more important is that you have savings to tap so that you have the freedom to take advantage of the opportunities in this longer work career. The other thing is the personal finance industry, I think, has done a disservice to people. The notion is, if you reach your mid-50s, you're 58, right?
Yep.
So if you reach 58 and you haven't saved much for your retirement, you're doomed.
I'm done.
You're doomed.
I'm done.
You're done for.
Yep.
And if you look at the median, the Federal Reserve number, the median 401k IRA for someone nearing retirement is $135,000. So if you annuitize that, that's going to give you $600 a month. So obviously not a whole lot of money. But what they're
I'm going to
underestimating...
be eating a lot of ramen.
You're going to eat a lot of ramen. But what they're underestimating is, look, life's expensive. Kids are expensive. I have to tell you, kids are really expensive. And the notion that you're going to save all this money while you're raising kids and you're pursuing your career and hopefully relationships and all these things is unrealistic. But when the kids leave the home and you're an empty nester, all of a sudden, all this cash flow frees up. And what the evidence is really clear is that if you work longer and you don't have to save it all, but you save, a chunk of it, and then you delay filing for Social Security until you're 70, which you get your peak benefit by delaying filing for Social Security, you're not doomed. And actually, you're going to do just fine. And to just give you the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, they gave this illustration. So you're a couple, you make $100,000 a year, and you're saving in the 401k 6% of salary, and you got a 3% match. And you're raising 2 kids. Mm-hmm. So when the kids are launched, and you're no longer paying for college or any of that, and you look at the cash flow, you can increase it by 18%. So notice you have a 12 percentage point. Mm-hmm. You could increase your 401k savings by 12 percentage points. Now that's a lot of money. Now what I would say is, well, back that off. Because now you don't have to do vacations around the kids. It's, it's the vacations you want to take. And yeah, you want to turn your garage into that, hobby place that you've been dreaming about all these years. That's fine. But you still can put a significant chunk of money into savings. So think about transitions over a lifetime, and then it really boils down to personal finance is 3 things. It's only 3 things. Save, keep your debts down, and invest in your skill and knowledge.
I don't feel so bad now. I feel like in a year and a half or so, when my son, I hope, graduates from college, I get that 12%. That actually, I want to take some questions from the audience soon, so get ready. I'm going to ask one more, and then the microphone is available. This gets to public policy, because what you just described as the typical way of setting out your work life and, in a sense, your life cycle as an adult, our public policy is built on that. It's set up to say, all right, you're going to retire at age X. Like you have to take Medicare, for example, at 65. And if you don't, well, tough. You can't have it. Right. If you work past 70, that's not going to help you any with your Social Security. What should we be thinking about in terms of public policy to make what people already want to do possible?
So I think it has incredible implications for our public policy. So you're thinking, what I have done, and people can disagree with this, but work is at the core. Because work is not just an income. And I think the economists have done us a disservice by emphasizing so much the income aspect of work, which is incredibly important when you have to pay those bills. But work is also a community. People care whether or not you show up. There are people you like. There are people you dislike. It's a community. And there was this wonderful phrase by this German economist at the Munich Center for Aging. And he said, even working for a bad boss is better for your health than sitting on the couch and watching TV. And so there's a lot of health benefits, because you think about going to work, you get up, you have to shower, you shave, you brush your teeth, you put on some clothes, and you got to get yourself to work. So there's some physical and mental aspects of work that are also important, that are good for your cognitive health. And then if we really take diversity and inclusion seriously, and we're including that are, experienced workers in the second half of life are welcome into solving this technology problem, then you're really getting things going. So our public policy is not focused enough on making life easy for people to work. Part-time, full-time, flexible time. So the core issues are universal health care, so that if you want to go off and start your own business, you can do it, and you don't have to worry about that you're not going to have, or your family's not going to have, health insurance coverage. Universal retirement savings plans. So it's just automatic, it happens. And then better training and retraining. Basically, there's very little training and retraining that goes on past the age of 40. And so you really want your training and retraining to be incredibly important. And you want to change this mindset of we can't afford it. We can't afford Social Security. We can't afford Medicare. I don't know what that really means, but that discussion is out there. Yes, we can. But these benefits need to be shifted toward a more work-centric, household-centric point of view, keeping people engaged, not in a punitive sense. So the punitive sense would be, okay, we're just going to raise the age of retirement to 70. And if you can't make it, tough. Life's hard. Mm-hmm. No. But if you create positive incentives for people to stay engaged in the workforce, mm-hmm. if they're able to do so, great. And if they're not, they're still protected.
And watch out what kind of creativity they're going to come up with. And ideas and all of the entrepreneurship that you're going to unleash with that.
So this is my theory, that there's a search for a big idea right now because we have an economy that has failed a lot of people. And yes, there's been some, decent movement in the economy, but it's not really picked up in growth. And the big idea is we have this aging population, this aging workforce. We have all this experience. So let's focus on keeping people attached to the labor force. Let's focus on turning to our experienced workers and saying, you're creative and you're innovative and you have experience, solve our problems. And let's really raise the labor force participation rate of the 55 plus, the 60 plus. And I think that this economy will grow a lot faster, but even if it didn't, the people who make up that economy are going to be a lot healthier and better off.
Wow. We have a question from the audience. Please.
Thank you so much for what you just said there. I really appreciate that. My name's Ovi Ovison. I'm a poet. I'm waiting for some laughter there. And a potter. So you know a little bit about my economic outlook. I've been working many side jobs back and forth, and what you said really echoes what Thoreau wrote in Life Without Principle about if all you receive for your day's work is wages, you've been robbed. There's so much more to work, and I see this as enlightening, what you're saying. As a potter, I'm trying to have a small business and ship stuff across the United States. I recently sold a $10 cup to a person in California. It cost $10 to ship it. So it doubled the price. My question is, how does someone like me compete with an Amazon who can do big shipping, free shipping, and stuff like that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And from your initial remark, just for anyone who's thinking about this whole purpose in a paycheck, there is a Studs Terkel, was a legendary broadcaster, and he did these interviews. And back in the 1970s, he interviewed a bunch of people. It's called Working. And it was, a person who worked on the railroad, and this was back in the era. A person was a secretary. I think there was an elevator operator. And the only famous person, I believe, was Pauline Kael. And she was the film critic for The New Yorker. So it's all these interviews. And the introduction is incredibly powerful because what he said in every single interview, there was this common theme. Everybody needs their daily bread. Everybody needs an income. And yet everybody expressed that desire for respect, for status, for meaning, for something bigger than themselves on the job and from the job. And so this is not what I'm describing, something that is only a desire among the well-educated white-collar set. It runs throughout our society. And it is to be embraced because, frankly, where do we spend most of our lives? It turns out it's going to be the workplace. Now, to the specifics, I don't have any, particularly blinding, insight that's going to solve your problem. But I do think what the dynamic of Amazon is twofold. One, it really does put a premium on the local, and the craft, and the creative. And so it's taking deeper roots in your local area, and establishing, and I'm sure you've done this, but establishing that reputation, building on that reputation, and there are growing numbers of people who both want to support craft and want to support local entrepreneurs. So it's feeding off of that, and I'm sure that's what you're already doing. And then in terms of the Amazon, it probably is more about, is there a pottery product that I can charge a premium for and tell the customer, as part of the price, it's paying for the shipping. And just be transparent, be upfront. Some customers are going to say, I'm not going to pay that. That's just too much. I'm going to, okay, that's fine. But other customers will say, well, I like it. This is a product that I want, and I understand why it is you're pricing it the way that you are. But it's probably not for a cup that you've thrown on the wheel. It's for something that you can automatically charge a higher price and then put a premium on top of that you just explained, this is paying for shipping.
Thank you.
We have another question.
Thanks for this super inspiring conversation. I have a quick comment and then a question. So just want to observe that about a month ago, Joyce Carol Oates was in residency on campus. She is well into her 80s and writing over a book a year. So, and many people would say she's at the peak of her power. So it's not even that her creativity is not declining, it's actually growing. So she was a great example of what you talk about. My question relates to the fact that you've talked a lot about entrepreneurship as a great pathway forward for, a rewarding, career for older folks. What about the person who wants to stay with a business, with a company, but maybe in a different way, a more flexible way? So I'm wondering what advice you'd have to that person, and also wondering, do we need to incent companies to think more creatively about how to take advantage of the resource of older workers?
So this is, I'm glad you raised this because this is a huge issue, and it's probably another hour discussion right there. But age discrimination is really real in many, many organizations. Now, you had the labor force participation rate of the 60 plus, 65 plus, 70 plus is going up. So there is something of a decline in age discrimination, but what is really changing management right now is this relatively tight labor market. And all of a sudden, many organizations are realizing if we want to sign this contract, if we want to fulfill our mission, we need to retain these experienced workers. It's not about retiring them, it's about retaining them. And so it was interesting, there was a precision manufacturing company not far from here with a lot of skilled workers and with a lot of machinists. There are machinists who are 60 and over, and then coming out of the technical community colleges, 20-somethings, but there's a real gap in the middle because there was a period about 20 years where people weren't going into the trades the same way. And so what the company is doing is investing in automation in order to keep the experienced workers around longer, because not only are they helping, do they have the knowledge to do the contracts, but they're also mentoring the younger generation, because it's one thing to learn how to do something, and then it's another thing to learn the intangibles about how you really do it or how an organization does it. So I think that on an individual basis, people have more flexibility in terms of negotiating perhaps a part-time deal, some sort of flexible schedule going down, because companies are wanting to retain their experience. From a public policy point of view, I want that to become more institutionalized. That just as the private sector employer will have a 401k, I think they should have a phased retirement program, that they should have a flexible program. And if you think about flexibility, that actually runs across the generations, because there are just times when people need flexibility in their work schedule. But you want it so that it's across the board as opposed to being able to negotiate because you and your boss get along. So there's flexibility is important when you have a child. Flexibility is important when you have an elderly parent who is getting ill. Flexibility is important when you kind of want to test out this retirement thing, but you're not quite ready to go there. And I think phased retirement can be really helpful. And also another type of program are called boomerang programs. So you've worked in an organization, and then you retire, and then you have to, by law, wait for 6 months. But you can go back to your organization and work up to 1,000 hours a year. And growing numbers of companies are creating formal programs because someone's going on vacation. Well, they know you. They know who you are. They know that you can do the job, and you're coming in and you realize, well, it's only for 2 weeks, and I'm going to make some money, and I'm going to see some of my colleagues, going to meet some new people, and it's kind of mutually beneficial. Or there's a big project that's coming along, and you need some bodies to throw at this project or an extra study, and they call somebody in that they know, comes in, doesn't want to work full time. So I'd like to see a lot more formal programs, and there are good ones out there, and they're tending to work in industries where there's just a lot of demand. So if you look at the hospital industry, it's a lot of people now, you want to work 0.8? You want to work 0.5? They don't want their skilled labor to go out the door. It's a big change. So as markets get tight, management becomes more flexible. Now the big twist is let's formalize that.
Got another question from the audience.
Thank you both for being here and putting on this talk. I was going to ask, what advice would you have for a young person who's coming out of college and is very motivated by the idea of being financially independent throughout their lives. So steps that younger people can take that'll set them up for that future of financial independence. Thank you.
So, there are going to be stages of your life where you won't be able to do this, but most of what it is whatever paycheck you earn, you take a little bit of that and you put it into savings, and you set it up automatic. And it's very easy in today's world. You go to your credit union account, you go to your online banking account or your bank, and you say, $10 of this goes automatically on the 15th into my savings account. Not much money, right? But you've established and you've automated the habit of savings. So that is actually the real key, is automate savings and do your, if you get a 401k, of a 403b. And then it's always, it's the basics. There may be some times when you have to put some money on the credit card, but basically the goal is the credit card isn't how you live above your means. The credit card is just convenient and you pay it off at the end of the month. And so you're wary of debt. Take on debt that provides you a return, a college education, some additional skills, owning a home. But then you don't want to take out a second or third mortgage, because that first debt is actually pretty good debt most of the time. And when people take it on, what they get in trouble is they take on too much. So it's automate savings as much as possible and turn savings into a habit. And all personal finance is a bunch of good habits.
One thing I wanted to ask you, and I didn't warn you about this in advance, is that I think your career in itself has illustrated this phenomenon that you've been talking about, because I'll let you tell the story better than I am, but my impression is that you have had a number of different careers over the course of your life. One that I know about is working as a merchant seaman.
Yes.
And a broadcaster and a journalist. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the phases you've gone through? Because you've lived it.
Yeah, so when I graduated from college, I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I became a merchant seaman, and for 4 years, and I worked in the engine room of ships, and my first job was as a wiper. And a wiper is a very good description of your job, because you clean the engine room and you clean the seamen's bathrooms. Ooh. And then I passed my Coast Guard exam, became fireman, oiler, water tender, and then I became an engine utility where you assist the engineers. And the first voyage was a 7-month back and forth from Europe to the Persian Gulf. And it was over July, over the summer, so it was really hot. And I loved it. I just loved it. And then I got to the Philippines, got to the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, out to Japan. And it was a real adventure. And then the way it is at sea is there's any romance you might have about, ports, forget about it. You're never there. You come into the port, time is money, and you're working while you're at sea, then you just go back out. And you would be paid. This was back in the era, you would be paid. So you arrive in Brooklyn. You've been doing this, been working for 7 months. You arrive in Brooklyn, and they hand you cash. Ooh. All your money. By law, they have to hand you cash. And you knew the people who were going to lose their money who went to the bar, yep. And there's another group of people who took cabs that went to the bank and deposited their money. So I did that for 4 years, and it paid for my going to the London School of Economics to get my master's degree. And then it was really where I became fascinated by economics, because I had saved a lot of money. And this was when, some of you may remember this, when Carter was president, Blumenthal was Treasury Secretary, and the dollar reached its all-time low against the British pound. And I became really interested in economics because I was doing really well. But by the end, we were down to the ramen noodles, so it was great. And then I decided I wanted to break into journalism, and I pounded the pavement in New York for over a year, and I finally was able to break through. Since then, my career has always been in journalism, but in different assets. Broadcast in terms of radio, public television and television, working at Business Week, now writing for things like PBS Next Avenue. And it's always been two strands, personal finance, or finance being one, and the other being economics. Mm-hmm. But the medium that you discuss these things through, that has changed a lot.
And you don't just the thing that I've always been impressed with is that you were always looking for that new thing. So you were one of the earliest people I knew who was doing what now we would call a podcast.
Right.
You were doing that kind of thing. It wasn't just something that's broadcast at a fixed time on a fixed day. It's available up there in the cloud. Wow, this is pretty cool. I like this. That is something that I think we don't tell our students enough about. We do way too much as a professor of, well, okay, here's the career we want you to start on, and we're going to train you for that. And one of the things that I've changed a lot about over the last 30 years of being a professor is not doing that, especially the last 15 years or so. It's like, I'm not going to train you to do anything specific. You're going to have skills, but you need to be able to graduate from college and maybe go to sea for a couple of years, or pursue whatever your passion is, and then follow some paths.
But I don't know if you would agree, but I actually, if you look at what you do, other professors here, St. John's, St. Ben's, you really do one thing, and that is critical thinking.
Yes.
And that is an incredibly valuable skill that lasts you throughout your lifetime. And if you graduate from this university with the ability to think critically, as a professor, you've succeeded, and as a student, you've succeeded. But I had a good friend who I'm convinced in the womb knew he wanted to be a lawyer, okay? No question about it. But most people I know, their careers have been circuitous. And what they studied in college doesn't have a whole lot to do with what they're doing in their 50s and their 60s, and they've pivoted. And so I think that's where critical thinking actually does become important, because you're asking good questions, and you may need to pivot. And pivoting is a good thing. And you may end up, and hopefully you do, you end up with something you enjoy doing, that you're surrounded by good people, and that is engaging. But the notion that you're actually going to know what that is when you're 21, 22 years old, I think is unrealistic for most people. Mm-hmm. There's always the person that knows they want to be the scientist, they want to be the economics professor. But that's a minority.
Right. So we're coming near the end of our time. If anybody's got questions, I'd like you to have the opportunity to ask them. I've got some still of my own, though. So one of the things that I wanted to think about a little bit is we talked about public policy, and you mentioned this idea, this concept of a big idea. Do you see anybody in the public policy sphere or in the political sphere who seems to be getting that these days? And I don't necessarily mean an individual like a candidate, but like, do you see movements in the political parties or in those areas where people are actually finding this, or do you see that they're kind of just looking for the next big thing and they're not seeing it right in front of their face?
So this grassroots movement that I call unretirement, this purpose and a paycheck, it's happening. It's a grassroots movement. It's everywhere. It has not really penetrated in Washington, D.C., and actually not in most state capitals, although I think on the state capital level it's changing. I do think on the metropolitan level that you're seeing more recognition of what's going on here. And the irony is, if you look at so many of the people who are involved, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi. And they're heavily engaged, and they're doing a lot of things, but it hasn't translated into, well, what are the policy implications? And I think people still think that's an exception. Mm-hmm. That's an exceptional person. Most people can't do that. And I think that's wrong. I think that actually when you start looking around, again, there's more and more people in that age group that are doing things, want to be doing things, and asking that question, what comes next? What do I want to do next? So I think the most exciting activity is happening on the metropolitan level. And there's an ecosystem that is growing, which is there's, on the academic side, there's like the Center for Retirement and Research at Boston College, and the Sloan Work and Aging, and the Stanford Center for Longevity. And then you have some institutes like the Milken Institute on Aging that is doing a lot of good work. And then the journalistic world is growing. So there's this incredibly exciting conversation that's going on. But as far as entering into our political realm, we're still not there. Really what we discuss this as is what it is: preserving or cutting Social Security, preserving or cutting Medicare, keeping 401ks the way they are or changing the 401k in a different way. So it's none of the discussion, it's largely dominated by finance as opposed to use the economic term, human capital.
As I read your book, I've kept thinking about, people talk about how divided we are and divisiveness and heated rhetoric and everything like that. This strikes me, the whole idea of purpose and a paycheck strikes me as a way to cut across political lines, generational lines, geographical lines, because ultimately that is all of us really want that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think it's happening more on the local level, because it's easier to do, and in the end, you kind of have to solve problems at the local level, and there's that pressure to solve those problems. And a lot of the sort of innovations about multi-generational living, I mean, there's lots of experiments going on that's happening at the local level, where some of the community colleges and technical colleges are devoting more resources to the 50-plus population. So it's not sweeping the country as far as the higher levels of politics, but on the local level, it is.
It's bubbling up. It's
It
under
is.
the surface.
It's a classic example of grassroots and unplanned. This is not happening through top-down planning. The pressure is going to bubble up for change.
Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great.
And thank you for joining us today here at St. John's St. Ben's. I especially want to thank the libraries.